Hello, boils and ghouls. It's me again, i.m.draco. Today we are here for a few short stories I have written through the past week. We are also celebrating a few things. First is the 1-year anniversary for the first video on this channel, which was a few weeks ago. Oops. The second is for October, and the fact that Friday the 13th falls in October this year, so it is truly going to be a cursed spooky season. So let's just begin. Story 1. Sticky Fingers. Anura's eyes were filled with rage as he blinked away the drowsiness he had been forced into. The drugs had slowly become less effective with each dosage, but his captors were oblivious to this resilience. The harsh treatments left him sore and miserable, but his fury propelled him forward. He broke through the glass tube and barely felt the sharp edges scrape across his toughened tongue. The fungus he was exposed to was intended to harm him, and it was prevalent as it grew through his skull. But it gave him an unexpected effect that his tormentors would regret. It altered the way he thought and processed the world around him. His eyes gazed at the cold room before his bleeding body, and his mind was made up. Humanity would fear creating him as he spread this rot through his species. Within that decay, however, his fellow amphibians would create paradise in a world they ruled, with him as their king. Story 2. Don't touch the wildlife. The little creature just appeared one day after a rather dreary night. The girl did her best to minimize contact with the creature, but after a week, the little fluff ball seemed to be starving. She thought that he would go scavenging during the night, but when she came home after dusk, she would swear that it watched her the entire time she walked to the front door. Eventually, she went over to the tiny animal and tried to feed it some fruit, hoping it would help. As she reached up to the little guy with a bowl of fruit, she did not see the small drop of drool that fell from his mouth. With her arm outstretched as far as possible, her gaze was turned towards the floor, and she did not expect what happened next. The little bat dropped onto her hand and quickly took a nibble from her, but it wasn't from the fruit. It was from her finger. It didn't hurt, so she barely felt it, and didn't realize he was doing it until she looked up towards the little body in her hand. The girl could see a few drops of blood begin to drip down her arm, so she slowly lowered the furry bat that was sitting in her palm. She was a little startled at first, but she felt like she could see a newly acquired glimmer in his little dark eyes. The brought a smile to her face, and she began to murmur under her breath, "Just a few more bites. It'll be fine. Just a few more bites." She began to wonder if she saw a smile stretch across the bat's tiny face, but that was impossible. Just a few more bites. I can cover that up easily. Just a few more bits. Suddenly, his name popped into her mind. Her breath trembled as the words escaped her mouth. Lord Ruthven. Story 3. Can you see? The days started out similarly to all the previous days. The alarm went off precisely at 0600. The lights promptly turned on 0605 in the area, and he looked towards his window to see the pitch-black scenery outside. If he didn't know any better, it would be easy to convince himself that just beyond the glass window was a green field with tiny animals scurrying around on this new day. He had been on this vessel long enough, though, to no longer need that sense of familiarity. The darkness was more comforting after 8 years aboard. He stared into the abyss as he got ready and eventually headed towards the moon pool to help the team prepare to launch for the day's research. They had no specific agenda, but were hoping to discover a new underwater system or some new species, so they headed out in their 6-person submersible. After a few minutes, they flipped on the external lights and settled in for the day's exploration. 8 hours later, they began to head back to base, and the journey was fairly uneventful except for one peculiar creature that appeared on the path home. He wasn't a new species or anything they hadn't seen before, but he stood out to him on this day. The scientist could not explain why, but it was as if he was looking directly at him through his milky eyes. It felt like his gaze slowly followed him through the water before he disappeared into the black depths. He continued staring out the window for a few more minutes before one of his colleagues broke his focus. "You see anything interesting out there, sir?" He blinked rapidly before turning towards his teammate. "Not really. Did you happen to see that telescope fish back there?" The associate began to shake his head and shrugged. "No, I haven't seen anything all day." The scientist woke up the next morning, feeling a little more groggy than usual, but he continued on with his normal routine, and the day continued on as normal. After another full day exploring the vast ocean, the team headed back to base and he saw the little sea creature again. Every day for the next 2 weeks he would catch glimpses of the strange creature, but none of his colleagues seemed to notice the animal. He even pointed it out a few times, but they never caught it with their own eyes, so he stopped pointing it out to them to avoid the awkwardness. One morning he was startled to find the creature floating outside his room window. He could hardly believe his eyes as he saw its face stare at him amidst the dark waters. His surprise was slowly replaced with an uncomfortable giggle as he continued staring at the animal. He whispered to himself in a barely audible volume, "I will call you Bernard." Bernard was always there. Not a single day went by without the scientist spotting the weird animal for the next 4 months. He began to hear the creature speak to him as the days went on. The scientist knew it was impossible, but he could hear the watery words being expelled from the animal's tooth-filled mouth one morning. Its voice was soft and melodic as it spoke to him. "Come closer, my friend. Come closer to me. I won't bite." It giggled sweetly, but its eyes remained unenthused. The scientist leaned towards his bedroom window until his nose was pressed lightly against the glass. Bernard giggled with amusement through his sharp teeth before turning away and disappearing into the darkness. The scientist stared at the black sea for a few more moments before continuing on with his day. After dinner, he saw Bernard again as he was walking to his room. He had never seen him through the hallway windows, but they were never the most ideal considering how small they were. He stared at Bernard with surprise. Bernard interrupted the silence with his soft giggle before speaking. "Come closer. I can barely see you through this." The scientist looked around cautiously before walking towards the window. A watery voice exclaimed with fear, "I can't see you still. Can you get closer?" The scientist stuttered with confusion. No, I can't get any closer." The scientist's face was almost flat against the window, and he could see panic in Bernard's face. The creature's voice was filled with sorrow. "Well, you have to get closer. I need to see you. It's so dark out here and I feel so lonely." What can I do? I can't get any closer with the window here. Can you come up through the moon pool?" The animal started to swim in small circles, and he seemed to be in a panic. "You can't leave me out here. You can't leave me alone." The scientist spoke in a comforting tone. I won't leave you. I'm here for you." The creature started to scream with fear and sadness. "I can't see you. I can't see you. Please help me." The man's heart started to pound within his chest as he frantically started looking for a way to be closer to the animal. He darted towards the first thing he saw and began to punch in his codes to override the safety mechanisms in place. He was going to help the small creature, no matter the consequences. He began to depressurize the room. Story 4. Rural. It was a beautiful day to be outdoors. The sun was shining bright, the temperature was comfortable, and the trails were in perfect hiking condition. Sam was excited to spend her day off in the wilderness, as she was very familiar with this area, so she confidently headed out alone. She brought along enough supplies for 3 days, even though she only planned to spend one night camping. She drove her Jeep to the end of the road before setting out on foot. She had no destination in mind and let her feet guide her wherever they wanted to go. After a few hours of hiking, she began to look for a scenic camping spot so she could set up before the sun went down. It only took a few moments before she found it. It was a remarkably untouched section of flat ground that overlooked the nearby lake. She paused for a few moments as the scenery took her breath away. She got everything ready for the night and made her meal before looking out over the still water. The sun quickly began to set, and the darkness overtook the campsite to where the only visibility was a few feet around her campfire. She started to doze off, listening to the crackle of her fire and the chirps of the wildlife waking up for the night. Sam was slightly startled when she heard a loud splash coming from the direction of the lake. There were very few animals large enough to make a noise like that, and she instantly became alert at the prospect of it being a bear. She wouldn't have noticed the sudden silence if her own breathing hadn't become ear-piercing. She subconsciously sat on edge with every muscle tight as she waited for any more clues as to what was out there in the darkness. She jumped when she heard a loud noise in the distance. It sounded like a mixture of growls and yelps, but they were all coming from one creature. She could not understand what was going on, but it sounded like the animal was being attacked by something, but no other noises were being made. She would expect to hear 2 animals growling or making noise in the distance, but not on this night. It was chilling to hear nothing else but the screams of one animal slowly being killed, until everything fell back into silence. She could hear her breathing again and the sound of her heart racing. A slight sense of panic surged as she realized her fire was about to die. She almost fell out of her chair as she reached over to throw another log on the embers, and slowly felt herself getting more comfortable as the fire grew in size. The bugs and frogs of the night slowly started to sing their song once more. She spent the next few hours listening for another mysterious attack, but nothing unusual happened again, so she hesitantly went over to her tent. She fell asleep quickly, despite the residual fear. The next morning, she woke up feeling refreshed and excited for this new day. She crawled out of her tent and lit the fire to make breakfast. It was a simple and fast meal before she began to pack up her belongings. After everything was packed up, she made her way back to her vehicle. It had only been a few minutes of walking before she ran into the path of a coyote, but it was behaving strangely and looked worn down. She stopped in her tracks and observed the unusual behavior of the animal until it turned its gaze towards her. Its eyes were milky in color, and its jaw appeared to be broken because it hung loosely as the animal turned its head. Sam covered her mouth as a pungent odor hit her nose. A look of concern swept across her face when the animal continued to stare at her. This was not how a coyote would normally behave. The animal began to start choking, and the dreadful noise was impossible to cover with her hands. Eventually, the coyote's body began to quiver as it collapsed to the ground, and it coughed up a thick pool of blood. Sam took a few steps back as she tried to stop herself from throwing up her breakfast. When she looked back at the animal, it was certainly dead, but she didn't understand why it was behaving so strangely. Perhaps it had some sort of virus or disease. She was not sure, but her gaze quickly darted towards the pool of blood that began to jiggle on the ground. She stared in shock and could faintly make out something that looked like a ring of teeth with some stringy arms coming out of the sides. It looked like it was gasping for air as the tiny arms began to feel around the ground. She covered her nose before leaning in to get a closer look. It was rather small, so she had to get within a few inches from it before it unexpectedly jumped. It moved with unanticipated speed and accuracy as it latched itself on her face, and the tiny teeth began to bite down on the soft tissue of her lips. She screamed in fear, and the creature swiftly squirmed into her mouth. The thing was so fast, it had already made its way down her throat before her hands started clawing at her already bloody mouth. She could feel that it was slimy, but the teeth made it hard, and she could feel it move down her throat. She began to gag as the sensation of choking grew stronger until she could feel it no longer. It must have dropped into her stomach, and her attempts to force herself to throw up were pointless. Her body began to shake as she tried to catch her breath. She forced herself up and ran back to her car before driving straight to her house. For the next few days, she felt completely fine, so she talked herself out of going to the hospital, and her appetite was healthy, if not increasing slightly. Suddenly, that all changed when her stomach began to ache and bloat. She stared at it with anger, and when she gently rubbed across the surface, she could swear she saw something moving beneath her skin. It was so stretched out, she was worried that a slight cut would cause it to explode. She stopped going into work and eating. She couldn't do much anymore but lay around. A few more days went by, and she felt her body slowly wither away. But one night, she felt a sudden need to go for a walk. She got a surge of energy and headed out to her local park. She didn't even lock the door behind her. Her vision was blurry because her sight had rapidly dwindled, but she could tell she was at the park with the small pool of water. The energy was burning away quickly, but she was able to fall on the ground next to the calming water. Her hand was cold as it touched the liquid surface, and a small smile appeared before she collapsed face first into the water. She died with this last bit of energy drained from her, but her body began to convulse, causing small splashes within the water. Suddenly, her mouth opened wide, and a stream of blood shot into the clear water, followed by hundreds of the little toothy animal she encountered in the woods. One by one, they would continue to infest whatever host they came into contact with. Sam could never have known she would be the carrier that would take the creature to their ultimate breeding ground. Story 5. Motherhood. The lively creature crept out of its cool shelter to begin her journey home. She did not know why, but something compelled her to go back to the area of her childhood. She traveled with earnest and hardly made any stops except for food, water, and shelter when it was too dangerous to move. The soon-to-be mother was overjoyed at bringing her children into the world in the same place she was born. She was happy to make her way through the harsh land to see the small tree stump she once called home. She hadn't been there since she was a young baby, and she knew she could rest peacefully beneath its strong shelter. Only a few more days. Only a few more days. She could feel herself start to grow weaker as time passed by, but she pushed through the exhaustion. She finally made it home. She looked around through her tired eyes and felt the warmth flow through her body. She dragged her tired body over to the protective stump and was finally at peace. A small stick scratched one of her eyes, but it did not bother her. She was finally home. She could feel her babies squirm around within her abdomen, and a smile spread across her face. A swift wriggle in her stomach caused her to grimace and have a crackly voice. "Whoa there, little ones. Just let me rest a bit." She laughed slightly, but the movement intensified by her unborn babies within her body. "Ouch!" she exclaimed. "Calm down in there." The little ones growing inside her body were tired of waiting though, so they began to rip and break through her body. The helpless mother screamed in pain as her flesh was torn from the inside, but there was nothing she could do. They were her children. She waited for this moment to see them, and here it was. Her eyes glazed over as they exploded out of her, just as she had done so long ago. Story 6. Mr. Mush. Those people around never understood. They never understood me. All I wanted was to be liked by them, but they couldn't even give me that. They made fun of me. They poked at me. They did everything they could to make my life hell. But now it's their turn. I won't forget what they did, despite all my efforts to befriend them. Why couldn't they just be my friends? I don't even care anymore, but they will. They won't forget me anymore. They called me Mr. Mush, but I will be the one laughing as I stare down upon their rotting flesh piles. Story 7. Caged. So many people looked at the cute fox and spoke to it with annoyingly high-pitched voices. Ah, look at the cute little baby. He's so small and adorable. The fox's ears writhed in pain at the voices around him, and he couldn't escape. There was no escape for him inside this cage. Sure, it was a nice home, but the frequent strangers made it hell. He couldn't stand it any longer, but one day, someone new visited him. It was a cold, crisp morning before the usual annoyances came to see him, and the human just stared at him through glassy eyes. A deep and guttural voice broke the silence. You hate them, don't you? You hate them just like me. The fox tilted his head with surprise at the question, and even more surprised about the fact that he understood him. To further his shock, he nodded his little head in agreement. A twisted smile spread across the stranger's face as he spoke. Good. Good, little one. I think you'll do well with this gift. Suddenly, the little fox was lifted from the pen he had called home his whole life, and was rapidly bit by the strange human. He squeaked with confusion before his body started to feel like it was on fire. He could feel something coursing through his veins, and he felt stronger. After a few moments, he could no longer contain his energy, and he slowly turned his head to the first visitors that loudly ran towards his former prison. A toothy grin spread across his face, and the last thing he heard were the screams of those people as he ripped through them. Well, that was it. And thank you, creeps, for listening to these stories I have written. I also drew some of the characters from these stories, and you can find those illustrations on my Instagram and Twitter, so go follow me there if you want. I would like to add new and different elements to my channel, so expect that in the future as well. Thank you, creeps, for sticking around, and I hope your October is filled with horror and scares during this spooky season. Bye.